Welcome to the 10th webinar as part of the ongoing pandemic lecture series hosted by Center of Asia Pacific Business Research, Economics and Innovations at JGBS. My name is Anuj Kapoor and I'm an assistant professor in the area of marketing and I will be moderating today's webinar. For today, it gives me immense pleasure to have Mr. Pramath Malik as the speaker, and we will be more than happy wherein he'll be sharing his views as part of the pandemic lecture series. Mr. Pramath is an MBA from MDI Gurgaon and holds over 10 years of experience across sales, marketing, and partnership in multiple industries spanning multiple geographies, including US, China, EU, and India, to name a few. He is currently working as sales director for Grid Dynamics, which is a digital transformation specialist organization headquartered out of San Francisco, USA. On behalf of all the participants and the team, I extend a very warm welcome to Mr. Malik, and we are so glad that you could make it. An additional set of thanks to Pramath for getting up so early in the morning. I'm assuming it is 6 o'clock there, and to wake you up at that point of time. So I think an additional set of thanks from my side for agreeing to have, for agreeing to host the session at that point of time. Now, Pramath will be sharing his views on a topic which is very appropriate and at the same time very significant in today's time, which is decision-making under uncertainty. Before I ask Pramath to share his views, I would just request all the participants if they can make sure that their microphones are on mute, and also to switch off their cameras. All the questions we will be taking towards the end. So if you have any questions at any point of time, feel free to type in your questions in the chat box, and I'll be more than happy to take them up for Pramath towards the end of that session. Now I'll be switching off my video and I hand over the virtual dais to Pramath. It's all yours.
Okay, thanks, Anuj. Okay, so we have a pretty heavy and heady topic in front of us. Decision making in general is never easy, especially if you're in an uncertain situation. And these are pretty tough times, as most of you can imagine, right? So my goal in this particular short presentation is to kind of just give you an overview of, let's say, some mental models, some thought processes, and some caveats which we have to keep in mind as we make decisions in this and similar situations. The goal is to provide these frameworks not just for, let's say, COVID specific aspects, but also in general, as most of you, go out and operate in the business world, you're going to run into a lot of situations where uncertainty is kind of the norm. And even in your own careers, as you sort of, make decisions in your life, as you make decisions, uncertainty is kind of the norm. So with that, that should set some context for all of you. And a little sort of trivial thing is that just because a lot of these things are very, very serious and they can be very, very theoretical, I didn't want them to, let's say, be very theory heavy. So kind of added a lot of GIFs. Hopefully that will be entertaining for you guys, and it'll help communicate those concepts a little easier. So let's kind of start from the top, right? The first aspect which I would like to sort of touch on is the concepts of risk and uncertainty. So all of us have heard these words before. We kind of have our own colloquial understanding of what risk means and what uncertainty means. And if you sort of look at popular media, right, these two images should capture how most people view risk and how most people view uncertainty. Risk is something which we attribute to have a specific set of negative connotation, in the sense that there's a potential loss associated with it. But then also there's some sort of outcome which you are looking forward to. And then you can make some sort of mental calculation that, hey, this is the risk, this is the reward. Does it make sense for in this or not? Uncertainty, on the other hand, is a lot more complicated. Uncertainty, you have no idea what's going to happen. It's a potentially, wide array of outcomes. Not all of those outcomes necessarily need to be bad, but just the uncertainty between whether I'm going to eat dish A versus dish B is still uncertainty. And if we sort of dive a little deeper, right? Like if we dive into, and because this is kind of the foundation, I'm going to do a little bit of theory here. These are concepts which even the academicians haven't really agreed upon, like what they really mean. So you'll see, like for risk, words like source of harm, charm, statistically expected loss, possibility of something bad happening. Like these are the kind of definitions which people have provided around risk. Uncertainty, on the other hand, like we said, these are situations where you have imperfect or unknown information. My personal favorite quote on this is that you can never be certain about uncertainty. So that's Frank Knight. Those of you who are like a finance background, he's actually a pretty good person to read on. He has a book called Risks, Uncertainty and Profit. It's like almost 100 years old now, but it's still like one of the foundational works on investing. Okay, so like with that, let's kind of go a little deeper. And again, this is, I promise you, this is one of the last slides where we go into the theory part with like text as heavy. But I kind of wanted to set that stage as well. So this is just a quick note from the ISO. And because, you know, this is from the Risk Institute, they think about risk a lot. They've kind of looked at the whole spectrum in like 5 different tiers. So one is that, you know, note one is you have a standard, like you have a deviation from something which is expected. It can be either positive or negative. Two is that, you know, these objectives, they have some sort of impact on your financial health, safety. Third is that, you know, these are referenced with some sort of event and consequence. And the fourth is like you have some sort of likelihood associated with each of these occurrences. So as you can see, risk is still, you know, being talked about with some sort of probability, some sort of certainty attached to it. Uncertainty, on the other hand, when we come to note 5, is talking about the state of like partial, deficient, or like no information at all about the consequences, and more specifically about the likelihood of each of those consequences. So if you were to sort of think of this as a spectrum, right? Like you'll see on the one side, you have quantifiable deviations, which are fairly, let's say, even predictable. Something, a very good example might be, you know, rolling a dice or playing cards or like a table of, like a roulette table. These are all fairly predictable. If it's a fair coin, it's going to be on heads 50%, it's going to be on tails 50%. On the other side, we have absolute uncertainty. And absolute uncertainty would mean that literally anything can happen. And we're going to dive into that a little deeper. So with that, let's kind of jump into like, you know, decision making. And again, like, you know, all of us are familiar with what decision making is. It's the process of identifying and choosing alternatives. The one point which I do want to highlight is decision making does not mean that the final choice we make has to have some sort of action associated with it. Inaction is also a decision. So the decision to not take an action is also a decision. And that is very, very particularly relevant in the COVID environment. And as you can sort of imagine, right, like the process of decision making is not something most of us enjoy. Most of us generally try to avoid making serious decisions. And particularly it's because of the consequences associated with it. If you look very specifically at even COVID, there are a lot of options which get presented, and each one of those options has one or more negative aspects. None of them is a perfect solution. And in the absence of that perfect solution, we are very shy of committing to any particular decision. And that's where like the mature process of decision making comes in. That's where the frameworks come in, and we're going to like dive a little deeper into that. But let's first talk about like, you know, why is it that most people don't want to make decisions? Like what are some of the potential challenges which people run into as they make decisions? So the most common, which I'm sure all of you have been familiar with, and I'm sure everyone's experienced at some point, is just analysis paralysis, which is like you're just absorbing more and more data. You're analyzing the problem from 100 different points of views. Every point of view is giving you a different perspective, and you know, you're probably getting different answers from different perspectives, so you still can't decide. And when you come very specifically again to COVID, very true, right? Whichever perspective you look at, You can look at it from a purely public health perspective, which is that, okay, every life matters. You can look at it from an economic perspective, that, hey, like, the economic impact of this is going to be massive. You can look at it from a national security perspective now, and there's that outcome there as well. And these are just some perspectives which you can think of. You can add, multiple layers of these perspectives to not just COVID, any similar problem which comes in. But usually the point which I'm trying to get across is analysis paralysis does at some point not help you in making those decisions. It's a big challenge which a lot of people struggle with. And then, the other side is just information overload, which is, if it's not analysis paralysis in the form of looking at the problem from different data points, it's just multiple sets of information coming at you from different perspectives. Again, if we talk more specifically about COVID, you will have different studies. You will have different opinions from experts. Some will say that, okay, wearing a mask does this, wearing a mask does that, or this thing gets transmitted through XYZ, this thing does not get transmitted through XYZ. And again, I'll steer clear of making statements about like what is and what is not. I don't think that's my place. But just kind of want to highlight that these are the kind of challenges which we run into, which is that you're going to get information from different points. It's very important to separate what is signal and what is noise. Otherwise, we end up in information overload. And lastly, like this, I think, is the most important problem, especially for people who are more entrepreneurial. People, if you're like, if you're somebody like me, who's more, let's say gung-ho, a little more decisive. The challenge which comes is that it's the exact opposite problem of analysis paralysis, which is like, there are people who like to go by their instinct. And, there's a very specific reason this challenge is called extinction by instinct, because your instinct can be wrong. And in some situations like COVID, your instinct can be significant, like the cost of you being wrong is very, very high. And again, think about the same thing from a business perspective. There are often decisions which you can make which can literally destroy a business. There's also, from a marketing or PR perspective, there's a very common saying, which is that to build a reputation takes, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. But if tomorrow, let's say a Nestle or a Pepsi does something which is socially unacceptable, that reputation gets destroyed overnight. And, the brand gets destroyed. So extinction by instinct is actually a real challenge. And I will say, like, it's one of the reasons we get educated or we get degrees like MBAs, or we even like statistics and economics, is to avoid that particular problem. Even if it, let's say, pushes us to analysis paralysis, society has on the whole generally decided that we're more comfortable with analysis paralysis than we are with extinction by instinct. Entrepreneurs on the other side like to take asymmetric bets. They like to go by their instinct, and some of them do really, really well. Again, the ratios, we'll get into that a little later. The biggest challenge or the biggest problem is actually not really a challenge. It's an outcome which happens as a result of decision making. It's called decision fatigue, and this is something which leaders suffer from a lot. And most of you, if you get into a managerial position or a position which is a decision making position, you're going to run into this a lot, which is that you have to make so many different decisions throughout the day. Each one of them has their own consequences, and if you start permuting all the different options or all the potential outcomes, it's going to become a huge drain of energy. And when you get to that stage, it's almost like a burnout from a decision-making perspective, and people switch to either, again, not making a decision at all, avoiding making any decision, or being very impulsive. And like one personal example I can kind of give is, like, let's say you're going out to buy a refrigerator. You've just been looking at data for like months, right? Like, and you've also been very busy with work, you've been busy with life, and just a lot is happening. And then one day you're like, okay, I'm done, right? I go into the store, this is the fridge I want to buy, just bring it impulsively to the house. And then like for the next 6 months, I'm like, this is not what I wanted. I should have like, like didn't make the decision I would have made. So it's a real common problem, especially in like businesses as well, where deadlines exist. But again, there's a bunch of stuff which we have to run through, and in like in respect of time, I'm going to run through some of these things a little faster. So, what's the solution? Planning to the rescue, right? Like that's what most corporations do. That's what most governments do. We make plans. We systematize our thinking. We try to decide what are potential outcomes. And before I dive into like planning, I want to kind of very specifically highlight some challenges which we run into as we are making these plans, and which affect how we think about things. And the ones which are highlighted, the ones which are bold, are things which I personally think are more relevant from thinking about COVID. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but like just a couple of them, I'll give you an idea. Like there's a big one, which is called ambiguity avoidance. So let's say you have two options. One option, with very precise, let's say possibility, that 40% chance it will do X. The other thing is, let's say you don't know the probability, but you know that it'll solve the problem, but you don't know if it'll solve the problem 5% or it'll solve the problem completely. We have a tendency to lean towards things where the outcomes are known and with a known probability. And often that shifts us to making decisions which aren't optimal. Another one is, which is relevant. And again, and once I explain this, I'll explain another aspect of thinking about biases. Biases are not necessarily bad. Is loss aversion. So generally, whether you're investing, whether you're making a decision, even in your personal life, there's a thing called loss aversion or endowment effect. And essentially what it says is like losses loom larger than gains. So if I want to make $1 of gain, $1 of gain feels to a person as the same thing as 50 cents of loss. So if I lose like 50 rupees, that is going to feel as bad as winning 100 rupees. And the reason this is relevant for COVID is something you can imagine. Lives are at stake. And the way you think about it becomes very, very relevant. Again, you can think about things, the exact same thing. If it's framed as 50 lives saved versus 50 lives lost, the 50 lives lost is going to look like 100 lives lost. It's going to feel like 100 lives. It's going to be equated to 100 lives saved emotionally. It's just a tendency human beings have. And again, like I said, it's not always a bad thing. These are things which prevent us from jumping into that extinction by extinct problem. And so evolutionary also, they've evolved for a particular purpose. But in situations like this, they can often push us towards the wrong solution. And then also like another thing is like normalcy bias, which is like we just want things to be the way they are. Status quo is like just a very common thing. And I'll not go into like zero risk bias. We can come up, like if any of these are interesting, we can cover them in the Q&A. So let's jump into like planning and narrative-based decision making, right? So one of the things, again, I want to talk about decision making is like most of us think that we make decisions in frameworks. That's not true for most of us. Most of us often make decisions in narratives. And what does that mean? We build stories. We will say that, and this is, even if you think about the way business is taught, it's taught in the form of case studies. Case studies are essentially stories, right? And the idea is that if I do this, this happens. If I do this, this happens. And what we are essentially doing is like we're looking at the present. We're trying to place ourselves in the present and the past, and saying that if I take action X, it's going to go to future Y. And if I don't like future Y, then I change my course of action. And personally, like when I think about it, I think about the way most of us make decisions is avoiding pain and going towards pleasure. And the reason this is a problem is because most of us think that we are like that agent in the Matrix. We are like dodging problems left, right, and center. When most of us don't have that capability. Most of us we're not great projectors. And this is like a snapshot from one of my favorite books. and it's on decision making, and specifically around narrative-based decision making, and talks about narrative rationality. And I'll just talk about the first line a little bit. Those of you who find it interesting can pick up the book, which is like, Mahabharata is one of my favorite narratives. And so when I want to say, yeah, Yudhishthir like goes, he's like, what is the greatest wonder in the world? Like he asks Yudhishthir, and Yudhishthir responds that every day we see people die, but still everyone wants to be immortal. So our desires are not necessarily linked with what we know to be the fact. And you can go into things like a little more detail. So how does statistics come into all of this? How does math come into all of this, right? So we have a concept of Bayesian updating in statistics. The idea of Bayesian updating is that as we learn new evidences, as we see facts which are not in line with our frameworks, which are not in line with our reality, we should update our reality. We should update the probabilities of different things happening. Unfortunately, most people are not very good at it. We do it very conservatively, very begrudgingly. But this is something which generally helps. Again, it has its own limitations, doesn't work in like rapidly changing environments where probabilities might be changing. But still, like it's a pretty good tool to generally have in your kit. Another thing which which does exist out there is mixed strategies. So I'm sure like those of you who've ever seen a game of soccer, you've seen a free kick. And the challenge of a free kick is very interesting in the sense that you have a person who's trying to score the goal and you have a person who's trying to prevent scoring of the goal. And the two of them have very antagonistic goals. Usually the challenge is more, the person who's kicking the ball has more control because they're the first one going. They don't have to necessarily base their decision on what the other person is doing, but the goalie has to be much more careful. The goalie doesn't have a whole lot of response time, to be honest, to decide whether they're going to dive left or dive right. And whichever way they dive, if they dive left and the kicker also has kicked it to the left, then great for them. They prevent the goal. Versus like the opposite. If like, they dive right and the kicker had, let's say, had kicked left, then a goal happens. And I'm bringing this up is because most of you will at some point get exposed to game theory. Nash equilibriums come up. Prisoner's dilemma is like something which is very commonly taught, but mixed strategies are not something which is commonly covered. And the solution to this problem is that it does have a Nash equilibrium, and the Nash equilibrium is just not very easily, like, as a human being, like if I was to look at these outcomes, I'd be like, I don't know how to make a decision here. Like I can kick left or right, I'm indifferent to it. But that is the solution. The solution is that 50% of the time you kick left, 50% of the time you kick right. And as a goalie, 50% of the time you dive left and 50% of the time you dive right. And if you look at the statistics of what actually happens in the games, in the sports, that is exactly what happens. So humans intuitively do that as well. Just wanted to bring this to the attention before we dive into let's say the specific aspects. So now everyone has a plan, right? Everyone's got some business plan, some career plan. Even for COVID, we have some plan. But the thing about uncertainty is that it doesn't like necessarily follow our plans. Like life, business, diseases don't care what our plan is. So Muhammad Ali has like a favorite, like one of my favorite quotes, which is like, everyone has a plan till they get punched in the face. And it's more about like how you react to getting that punch, which makes you a good boxer or which makes you a good executor versus just having a plan. Like making a plan part is actually the easier part of things. It's more about how can you operate in that dynamic environment. Every day we have new information coming out saying that, okay, we did this and this happened. How do you absorb that? How do you interpret that? And how do you update your decisions? So I like planning just like anyone else, but these are some things to keep in mind as you're making plans. Like plans can create rigidity. They don't necessarily work in dynamic environments. If you're an organization and you have very specific plans, it can actually reduce the creativity of each and every individual involved. Because they have a very specific place, they know what they're supposed to be doing. Also, planning comes with a huge cost, both in time and money. Also, when we are planning, we tend to underestimate what time and money we're going to spend in actually executing. Almost always, especially if you are familiar with the government programs, the time and money involved is an order of magnitude higher than what the planning had estimated it to be. Yeah. Okay, now let's get into some of the little deeper or heavier side of math. Again, I'm not going to go into the theory. I'm not trying to scare you guys away from it. In fact, I'm trying to attract you to it. I want you to think about these things. All of this stuff which I'm talking about is, is available out there. It's on Wikipedia, it's on YouTube videos, it's on like books which are available, and I'm pretty sure most of you can easily grasp this stuff. But okay, let's dive into the specific problem, right? Like chaos and randomness. These are two common concepts. Again, colloquially, we have some interpretation for them. Most of us, when we think of randomness, we think of, let's say, a roulette table, a game of dice, or cards, right? And chaos, you think of like a hurricane, you think of the markets going crazy. And that's exactly what happened with COVID as well. That once this thing started, let's say, spreading in the Western world, there was worldwide panic. And everyone just chaotically sold their positions. Now, most of the markets seem to have recorrected. Especially in the US, the markets are back where they were like 3-4 months ago. So if you had panicked at that time, if you had let that chaos sweep you, you would have been paying a huge cost right now. Let's say if you sold at the bottom of the market, you lost like 30-40% of your wealth or whatever your invested portfolio was. If you were a business which decided to make certain decisions based on that false information, or not false, but like based on that inaccurate forecasts, or like, let's say, fearful forecasts. Again, we don't know what's going to happen, so let's not go into that. But like, yeah, let's say if you were a business which made those decisions, you could end up looking at some losses right now. So I wanted to make it a little more interactive, but let's get back to it towards the end. I want you to just take a 10-second thought in your mind. It's like, what comes to your mind when you think of randomness? What comes to your mind when you think of chaos? Okay, so let's now go to the next step, right? This is the paper which came out in 2012, and the purpose of this paper was that there were these scientists in American Institute of Physics, and so there's this thing in math called chaos theory, and the idea of chaos theory is that you try to predict dynamic systems, and they try to build a model for very specifically around like dice, and they were like, can we predict what happens to a dice? And they were like, yeah, we can. Like, these things are not random. Thinking that a coin flip or a die or even like roulette tables are random is actually very naive. They're not random at all. If you know the initial condition, you can very accurately predict where the die, which face the die is going to land on, or where the roulette ball is going to land on. There's actually stories about physicists going to Vegas and kind of like, taking advantage of the casinos because they were with a camera doing, and with some small computers, able to forecast where the ball's going to land, and they were able to, you just need better odds, and like you don't need to be perfect. So again, and the most important thing here is that not only are these things predictable, they are not chaotic. So let's come into like, what is chaotic, right? So this is what chaos looks like in math. It's a double pendulum, and the idea of a double pendulum is that you don't really know what it's going to do next. Like, if you look at just the action of this thing, this is generally how these things like function, right? And it looks very random. It looks very chaotic, but it's not. It's a purely simple mathematical function. It's something which can be easily modeled. The challenge is that even a slight change in the starting position will fundamentally alter where the final positions or what the path is. I'm sure you've all heard about like the butterfly effect as well. This is also an example of chaos in math, which is like using iterative functions. You can generate most of these nature-based models. So there's a lot of chaos which exists in nature, and The explanation for chaos theory is like that when you try to, a function is called chaotic when a very small change in the present value doesn't necessarily allow you to approximate what the future value is, which is like if I am, let's say, 6 feet tall, then I get to a certain goal. But if I'm like, let's say, 6 feet and a half inch tall, my entire life story changes. My entire trajectory changes. That's chaos. And that is actually closer to what really happens in business and life. And I'll come to why this is relevant for COVID. Specifically on randomness, this is one of my favorite quotes again by an Israeli mathematician. And he talks about like that things can be in disorder, but there is no complete disorder. And what that means is if you're like somebody who actually likes math, you don't believe in randomness. There are things we know and there are things we don't know. Like we just don't know how to model them. We just don't know how to like how that function operates. Yeah. Okay, and then so coming specifically to chaos in COVID, right? So again, it's the double pendulum which we talked about, and now you're seeing like it in action. You're seeing different 3 different versions of the double pendulum going through very different trajectories. And a double pendulum and like an outbreak, like a COVID outbreak, isn't just a double pendulum. It's got a lot more moving parts. It's got like a bunch of chain events, and these chain events can reinforce or significantly weaken each other. So I'm sure most of you have heard of the concept of like A/B testing and things like that, right? Like those are predictable functions where I make a small change here, I see a clear change in the outcome, and I'm able to correlate those things. They're like usually works really well in a lot of simpler systems. But in like these kind of complex chaotic systems, the data can get really messy. The data can get really, really noisy. And it becomes a lot harder. Like you need harder science. You can still figure out what is happening, but it just becomes a lot harder. Things become a little more hard to discern. So that's something to keep in mind, even in business, right? Like 2 companies, one company spent $1 million in marketing, another one spent maybe like 1.1 million. And you're like, this company should have done 10% better, but they've done like 100% better. Like, it doesn't make sense. Like, why did that happen? These things happen. These things are like chaotic systems. Opposite can also happen, right? So again, we can go into this a little later. Why in personal decision making? So this is a lady like from France. Like she died at the age of 122. And in a lot of her interviews, she would mention that she smoked like every day. Like she would smoke like a cigarette after lunch and after dinner. But that goes counter to every scientific fact which you might have heard about smoking, right? Like smoking is supposed to cause cancer. Why isn't she getting affected? Again, human beings are also complex systems. There's a lot of moving parts which go into these things. And just because she got lucky doesn't mean that smoking is not smoking doesn't cause cancer. What we can easily infer over, like, let's say, we have inferred over longitudinal data is that smoking has these effects, and it's been very well attributed. And sometimes, like, there is that element of faith which people talk about. Good science, if you are not able to do it yourself, will require you to have an element of faith. Personally, if you can, I would say dive into things. It's a lot better. If you can't, yeah, like you have to leave on that, like, and that's particularly again important in in business. So again, now let's come to like how to make decisions on a personal level, on like a business level. So again, just take 10 seconds, think about this graph and tell me, like, or like think in your mind, what is really happening here? Where do you think this will go? Okay. And then this is actually like, this is a fact, right? Like in math, we say sin x for small values of x is equal to x. So something which is sinusoidal might look like it's a linear curve. And similarly, that's what confused us with COVID. Initially, a lot of people were like, yeah, this is a linear thing. It's not going to, grow exponentially. But the scientists had seen it before. We had, at least in this case, a clear model for how these things operate. And so they were able to raise that alarm early. But often you might run into situations where you don't have a model before. And just, again, think about it. You might think that you're being very scientific. You might think that I'm being very mathematical. But you're still running in that narrative mode, which is like, I think it's a linear curve. And I have looked at this much data. So this is what Taleb calls the black swan effect. And stuff like that happens as well. Okay, so how do you start orienting yourself? These are some questions which generally help me. I think they should help you as well. Is like, understand, is this a linear system? Is this a non-linear system? What is the predictive power of the data you're seeing? Are you seeing the data make sense, or is the data actually confusing you? And more importantly, when you're making decisions, sometimes you can even ignore the data, like when you're making a decision. Because what really matters is risk management. Is like, you have to understand what is risk, what is reward. You have to understand this concept of, like, again, I'm borrowing heavily from Taleb here, but he calls this mediocristan and extremistan. So mediocristan is like, let's say if it was a normal curve, things happening within the first standard deviation, and extremistan is like tail events, right? But again, these tail events have huge impact on things. COVID is a tail event. It's something which happens once in, at least on this scale. I think last time it happened was like 100 years, and like yeah. But the impact is massive, and we're all feeling it. On an economic cycle perspective, this is something which happens every 5 to 10 years, right? You have an economic crash every 5 to 10 years. It's just like a cadence, right? So understand what is your risk appetite when you're making plans. Understand whether you're linked to loss, which is like some people, like who are value investors, might be able to bear volatility, but some of us might not be able to bear volatility. So it's also important to understand, sometimes you might think that, no, like, I'm able to temper loss, but it's not just loss which we are getting exposed to. Often we're getting exposed to volatility. And yeah, so this is something, you can go really deep into this. This is the real challenge, which like really comes into things, which is like, how do you know if you're in a chaotic system, right? And so the good news is that chaotic systems are still deterministic. And what that means is, like, if I put in the same input, it should still lead the same output. But if I change the input a little bit, everything changes, right? Like the whole game changes. So you can make simulations around that. And there are people who do that with everything, right? Like we do it now with big data. We do it with the stock market. We do it with consumer behavior. So the math is there. Just lean on these things. Again, my goal with this presentation is to not give you a theory lecture, but to tell you that these things exist. Lastly, this is the last slide, but I want to kind of leave you with this one more thought. And this is the concept of roughness. And most of us, when we are taught things at school, in college, we're taught things in the form of averages. We're taught things in the form of medians. We're taught things in like clean linear functions, things which are smooth and continuous in mathematical terms. But in mathematics, we also have this concept of roughness, which is actually very new in the grand theory of math. It's only some 30, 40 years old by this guy named Benoit Mandelbrot. And so the challenge is this, right? Like, which is like, you have the island, which is England. How do you estimate what is the coastline of this island? So if I take a tape measure, which is about 200 kilometers long, then I measure the coastline to be 2,400 kilometers. But instead, if I actually now narrow down my tape measure to like 50 kilometers, then my coastline becomes 3,400 kilometers long. And in fact, the smaller you keep making that tape measure, the longer the coastline becomes. So it becomes a huge challenge with the, these are called rough surfaces. And like another example is like, this is a broccoli. In India, like you can look at a cauliflower, right? Like or gobi, right? They are rough surfaces. What is the surface area of a broccoli or a gobi? And like, you know, if you keep zooming into them, like you'll see like you have the exact same pattern, which is repeating. And as a result, the surface area just, the smaller scale you look at it, the surface area keeps growing and growing and growing. So at some point, also keep that in mind that you might be, they're called fractals, by the way. You might be dealing with fractals. And if you're dealing with fractals, understand that, you know, you're dealing with approximations. And yeah, and that's about it. Any questions, thoughts, suggestions?
All right, just let me put in my screen as well. Thank you so much, Pramath. I cannot stop myself from saying Pramathism at its best in terms of the content and in terms of
hopefully it was practical and not just like, you know,
no, exactly, it made sense. That's why I said, you know, it made a lot of sense. Thank you so much. I think there was some phenomenal slides and some great content. Now I have a couple of questions which have been forwarded by some of the speakers and some of the participants, and I'll just read out to you one by one.
Okay.
The first is, what do you feel in terms of strategy for business in today's time? Is there a best strategy which organizations should follow?
Like every organization out there?
So in generic.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, okay, so again, what is strategy, right? Like strategy is in a way a set of decision making, right? And you've sort of simplified it in business very specifically. When we say strategy, we say that, okay, we are employing a low cost strategy, or we're employing like a let's say a high premium like luxury good strategy, or we're employing a bottom of pyramid strategy. There are like these different strategies. But what are these strategies? They're essentially a set of decisions. And again, go back to that narrative-based decision-making concept. There are a set of stories which have been told, which is like, hey, the bottom of the pyramid is this big. And if you go after that bottom of the pyramid, you'll be able to invest in these emerging markets which are growing. And it's an entire story if you really think about it. Each one of those is loaded with assumptions. And the same holds for most of these strategies. Personally, what I would say is like, and I was hoping to cover that in the presentation. Steve Jobs has this very famous quote, which is that you can only connect the dots looking backward. So hindsight is always 20/20. Steve Jobs went to this college called Reed, where he dropped out of, and there he learned calligraphy. And later on, when he was making the Macintosh, that calligraphy came into all the fonts. So one of the reasons we have these nice fonts today is because Steve Jobs went to that calligraphy class. And so these things happen, right? Like, you know, a lot of, and again, it's a chaotic system in that perspective. There are certain things which we know work better than others. So for example, financial jurisprudence is really like, there are very solid things there. You should like over leverage is a big problem. And I want to cover that aspect to answer this question, right? Which is like, let's say very specific to COVID. You were an airline business, you were a hotel business, you were like a restaurant business, and let's say delivery wasn't like your core, you were a sit down restaurant. And you knew that you could make 10% profit. A lot of people went into like, you know, the economy was great. We had like a 9-year long run, and money was cheap. Money still is cheap. You can get loans at relatively low interest rate. So a lot of businesses over levered. They got to the point where they were significantly leveraged. They had done some, they call it sensitivity analysis, that, okay, we can take 5% revenue cut and we'll be fine. Nobody had predicted, like, again, this is a black swan event, right? In that sense that nobody had predicted that revenues would drop to zero. And that's what happened with a lot of these airlines. That's what happened with a lot of hotels, like revenues dropped by 70, 80%. That's what happened with a lot of restaurants. And there's going to be a lot of bankruptcies as a result. So generally there's this thing, and again, going back to that concept of mediocristan and extremistan, And again, the concept of avoiding extinction. Once you go to zero, even if you grow at 5,000 times of zero is still zero. So avoid zero. That would be my one strategy. Just always avoid zero. Anywhere else you go, you can still grow back. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. The second question is from Himanshu Dhumal. And his question is, what kind of organizations do such models prove most useful to?
That's a very good question. Yeah, so great question. Data, right? These things can require intensive amounts of data. So again, I covered a set, an entire spectrum almost, let's say, of decision-making tools. The basic heuristics which we talked about, right? Like groupthink is a bias which comes in. That is true across the board, whether you're a 4-person startup or whether you're an IBM with 200,000 employees across all the geographies. Groupthink does come in. Other things which are more specific to understanding chaotic systems, you need a lot of data. You need a lot of data. You need a lot of compute behind that data. You need people who are actual research scientists, data scientists, who understand how to tease insights out of that data. So in that sense, there is right now a little bit of, let's say, the playing field isn't as even for smaller companies in this data revolution.
All right. And in support of the same question, I think Anshul Khera has asked a question, which is, how do you check the reliability of any data in these times?
Beautiful question, right? So two things I'll say to that. One, there are general tools. So first things first, let's start from the first principles. Causality is a fundamental, think about causality, read up on it in general. We have so far, there's this whole concept called epistemology, and you can explore all of these things to the nth degree. But my goal here is to causality is one of those things which we still haven't really, unless we make some assumptions. We have to start from some sort of assumptions, and then we can prove causality to some extent. But without those assumptions, proving causality is still not something we have figured out. And again, I won't get into Pramathism, but that's a big challenge. But what we have done is that we have made some of these frameworks. Like p-value is a common framework which research scientists would use. Essentially, what that means is it says that, okay, the probability of this or all the rarer events happening is less than 5%. So we assume this to be capable of rejecting our null hypothesis. And that's one mechanism scientists use to prove things. On data reliability, you have, again, tools which are around data quality. So you can compare your existing data to previous data. If things have not changed significantly, you will remove outliers. And the reason I said it was a really good question is because you cannot do that right now. Right now, we are in extremistan. And because you're in extremistan, outliers are your friend. In fact, you would want to collect data on all the outliers. You would want to compare this to what happened in 2007, 2009. And unfortunately, the process of data collection was not as robust or as well established back then. And if you go even further, right, just having one financial crisis is not enough. You want to have all the financial crises which happened since let's say 1850 or something. We don't have data on a lot of those. We don't have a whole lot of data on the Spanish flu, which happened in the US in 1918. We have some data, but is it reliable enough for us to build models? Right now, most people don't seem to be paying a whole lot of attention to it. So yeah, this is actually a really big challenge. In these extraordinary times, you do have to be a little more intuition based, and sense making has to come in.
All right, great. A couple of questions more, and I'll just try my level best to take all of them. The next question is from Arvind Yadav, who asks, Uh, chaos versus randomness with respect to investments. What can
Mm,
be an effective investment strategy in such times?
okay, that's a pretty interesting question. Chaos versus randomness. So chaos versus randomness has its own implication in investment world, and the implications are fairly clear in sense of like small changes in your starting strategy can have significant impact. Like a common example you can think of is like, let's say you start investing when you're 21 versus if you start investing when you're 22. Even if you were putting in the same amount of money throughout your investment, the actual money you'll end up with. Actually, no, that's not an example of chaos. That's more an example of a deterministic system. Uh, I honestly don't know. I don't think I know an answer to this question.
Perhaps
Yeah,
what we
that's a
can
thing.
do is, we already have email of Mr. Arvind Yadav, and
Yeah,
perhaps you both can connect once the session is over
sure.
offline to take this question.
Yeah,
All right. The next
yeah.
question is from Akriti, who says chaos, decision making, and randomness. Which one is going to dominate during the pandemic time?
Okay. I mean, so this is what I would say to that, right? Like I said, if you're somebody who follows the more advanced mathematicians, you don't believe in randomness. You believe that there are things we don't understand. So I'm going to replace randomness there with uncertainty. And I'm going to reframe the question to what was the second thing? Chaos. What was the
Chaos,
second thing?
randomness, and decision making.
Okay, so I'm going to say that between chaos, uncertainty, and decision making, which is going to dominate, right? So again, we are definitely in a chaotic system. There are definitely aspects of this which are highly uncertain right now, and we have to make decisions fast. And I'll give you an example of what happened in 2007, 2009. So again, this is a study. I want to say it's by Booz Allen or someone. But what they noticed was in 2007, 2009, there were companies which were in a good enough situation that they did not have to stop their investments, versus a lot of companies had to literally, like, they got scared, let's say, by the unpredictability, or maybe they just weren't in a good enough financial situation. They significantly cut down on their R&D and on their investments. And the correlation they have found is that even today, 10 years later, the companies which did not stop their investing actually outperform those companies by almost double digits. And and again, if you borrow from Taleb, there's this concept of anti-fragile, which again, I'm not a fan of that particular concept, but it's an interesting concept. The idea is like there are businesses which can gain from volatility. And if I was to tie back Irvin's previous question, what I would sort of say is that if you know that this is a chaotic system, and if you have somehow figured out the underlying mechanisms of predicting that chaos, you're in a pretty good position. Like the market might be freaking out, and you might be like, yeah, this is great. I'm just going to buy a bunch of calls, and you can make money. Unfortunately, I think that easy money has been made. I think the markets are, at least in the US, back to where they were. So, but there are people like who did that.
All right. All right, great. Now, last three questions that we have. First, I'll ask Professor Meenakshi Tomar. Professor Tomar is an assistant professor at Jindal Global Business School. Professor Tomar, if you could please unmute yourself and ask the
Yes,
question
I
directly.
have unmuted myself. So I, on behalf of the center, first of all, I would like to thank you, Mr. Malik, for bringing such an innovative and a much needed topic on the table. And believe you me, our foreign partners are really awaiting to have a look at the video. They've already posted so many requests since evening today. My question is post-decision making. So there's a concept of resilience, which I am sure you will believe companies do not really want to go with, but it's very, very important. Just to give you an example, a very popular brand in India started calling up its clients who were purchasing to a ticket value of 10,000. every time whenever they were visiting the store. They
Okay.
called up their clients and asked them to give them money, cash. Ask them to, sort of put this cash with them. And once the lockdown is lifted, the client can go and shop for 50% more value than what has been contributed
Okay.
initially. Now, if you look at resilience, not many people vouched for it. The impact on the brand image was altogether very, very negative. And people started believing that the company is not just into losses, but they have, played high time with the kind of quality that they always associated them with. And luxury brand has a lot to do with social status for many clients.
Exactly. Yeah.
What is your take on the opinion of keeping resilience intact whenever you're making a decision, especially in uncertain times, with respect to chaotic situations like this? So to me, it is a chaos, not
Yeah. No,
a
I mean,
very situation.
yeah, that's a
Certainly
very good
cannot be
question.
backed by data.
Yeah.
Certainly cannot be
Yeah.
backed by data.
Yes. So that's a very good question, right? Like it's one of those. Again, I don't know which this company is, so I don't want to specifically say things. But like from what you described, it sounds like I would put it in the extinction by instinct category, which is like they went on their instinct, and as a result, we talked about this, right? Like they've significantly hurt their brand reputation. And it takes years and years to build that brand. But the damage which is going to be caused by this particular instance, it might cost them a while. But again, being the devil's advocate, this is what I will say. When survival is at line, and if really survival was at line, and the options for them were to either go under or take a hit on their brand, it could have been also a calculated decision that, okay, like we might get a hit on our brand, but if we don't do this, then we are going to go bankrupt. So it can be justified, but personally, I would like to focus more on the first aspect of the question, which you said, which is the resilience aspect. And like Taleb calls it like the robustness aspect. And like, that's again the same thing which I wanted to focus on with leverage, which is if you look at like airlines in the US, right? Airlines generally have been not a very good business. In fact, like Michael Porter has written case studies on, and he's applied like the Porter's 5 forces model to airlines on why airlines are one of the worst businesses to run in, because like all the 5 forces are working against you. And traditionally that's been true over like hundreds of years. Like generally airlines don't make a lot of money. And but over the last few years, consolidation happened in the airline industry, and people's hope changed. That okay, now the dynamics of the system might have changed. But again, it was a heavily levered, like most of these operations are heavily levered. And what that does is that it puts you in this position where you have to make these harder situation choices. And the analogy which I would draw is this, right? You would not personally want to put yourself in a situation where you have to, beg for money, because, yeah, and or you would not want to put yourself in a situation where you might be like, okay, now I have to borrow money from all of my close friends, and so on and so forth, because I took excessive risks. And often that does happen, right? Not because of people's own fault, because of we make decisions based on the information we have, based on the models we have. And most people, even businesses to that extent, are not good at again, thinking about extremistan, thinking about these rare events, which are actually not that rare. If you think about it, like every 5 to 7 years, you have something like this happening. So generally, I'm in agreement with you. Like I would strongly advise businesses, and if you look at most big luxury brands, whether it be an Hermes, whether it be a Louis Vuitton, or whether it be even like, if you even put Apple in that category, they have so much cash on their balance sheet, and it's for a reason. These brands rarely go on discount. They're much more like, if they have to sometimes, like if they put out a bad product, and or not a bad product, like a product which isn't, let's say, selling well, they're like, okay, we made a mistake, we'll eat the cost, and they have these huge margins. So the luxury business works in that process, because brand is something which you cannot let get dinged easily. And yeah, I hope that answers your question. Sorry.
Thank you so much. That completely answers my questions. Thank you so much.
All right, great. Now, last two questions. One is by Mr. Das. The other one is by Himanshu itself. Now, the question asked by Bishwajoy Das, and if I'm reading his name correctly, is pretty long. So what I would request is, Mr. Das, if you could unmute yourself and ask the question directly to Pramath, I think that'll be great. Would you be able to do that? Let me just check if I need to unmute him, if in case that is the case. Happens a lot of times. All right, so Mr. Das, can you hear us? So till the time we figure out where Mr. Das is, we'll move on to the next question, which is by Mr. Himanshu Dhumal. And what he asks is, how do you choose between fast decision making versus decision making based on maximum data and analysis? And the second part is, how do you identify the optimal time to spend on decision making, especially in smaller organizations?
Very good question. Very, very good question, right? Let me think about this, because I think this is actually a really, really good question. So there's a book called Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And Kahneman's like, he's a Nobel Prize winner. He's sort of the father of behavioral economics. And the whole idea of that book is that human beings operate in two systems, system one, system two. And forgive me, I don't remember which one is which, but one of them is a fast thinking system, and the other one is a more slow hunch-based system, which takes time. It's the Archimedes perspective, right? Like Archimedes took so long to realize that, okay, this is how buoyancy works. And but the fast system is like, okay, like I see this, I like this, I'm going to do this. And then there's also the Malcolm Gladwell book on fast decision making, Blink, which has its own, which is not without controversy, right? So generally, this is what I would say. And another perspective which I would throw in is, like, if you look at Steve Jobs, Zuckerberg, a lot of these people also have the whole concept of cognitive load, which is like wearing like a sweatshirt every day for Zuckerberg, or wearing that black turtleneck for Steve Jobs. He was like, I'm really saving the cognitive cost. So going back to the same framework which we talked about, there's this concept of decision fatigue. You don't want to have a lot of decisions, so you want to have a certain number of decisions. And a good proxy in general is like how often you have to make a decision. So even food, for example, right? Like personally, we eat food like 3 times a day, and you eat it for like 70, 80, 90 years of your life. And if you're spending like 15 minutes every day deciding what to eat, you're making a lot of investment in deciding what to eat. Versus if you have a specific set of factors which you've thought about once, not that you've not thought about it, but let's say you sit down one day and you're like, all day today, I'm only going to think about what I'm eating for the next 3 months, next 1 year. That might be a better return on your investment from a time perspective. And again, I might not be a very exciting proposition for most people who are foodies. And they might just want to go on new dishes, like, every day. That's a different argument then. But that is a potential tool which you can use. And when the decision making is more utilitarian, then it becomes even easier, which is like, think about what can be automated, and what can you do once and just get it done with, and what is specific to each and every situation. So for example, what would be an example of something specific? Okay, I don't know. Like I can't think of like a example, but like specificity might be like, what do you want to gift your dad on his birthday, or your wife, or your whoever like a significant person in your life is, and what do you want to gift them on their birthday? That's something you do once a year, and the impact on how much thought you put into it has a significant outcome. So you do want to invest a lot more time, and you can think of it as data, which is like, I know what they like, I know what they don't like, I know what it costs, I know what it doesn't cost. Decision making is decision making, whether you're doing it for a business or whether you're doing it for your own.
All right, great. I hope he's been able to answer Himanshu's question.
Yeah,
and
let me know if that was not
yes,
in line with
otherwise again what I'll do is I'll connect you with the relevant people, and then you can discuss it offline. There are a lot of questions, but due to the paucity of time, what I'll do is I can share the questions with Pramath. We'll just take this last question, and then the other questions I can share it with Pramath, and I'm assuming then Pramath, whenever you would have time, you can write back to them answering their questions which they might have. Now, this last question is from Ravina Gupta, who asks, how does decision making in uncertainty is different from decision making in under risky situations?
Very good question. Very, very good question. And that is kind of the crux of the presentation, if you think about it, right? Which is like the very first thing we talked about was like, how do you differentiate whether you're in a risky situation or whether you're in an uncertain situation? So let's take an example, right? An uncertain situation would be me making an investment into a certain business. A lot of factors which I don't know how they're going to play out. I don't know the probability. I don't know the outcome of what the upside is, versus, let's say, betting. And again, betting is a very clear example of a risky situation. Like, I know how much I'll win, I know how much I'll lose, and I know the probability of each win and each loss. And so how do you make that decision? So there's a common concept for making risky decisions, which is called expected value, which is like, let's say, I'm betting on a coin flip, and the bet is that I bet $100, and if I win, then I get 200. If I lose, then I get, I lose my $100. So if I flip a coin, and like a coin is fair, right? So it's an indifferent situation, which is like, it's not really, it doesn't give me any benefit to actually take on that risk. I'm exposing myself to volatility, but I'm not gaining anything in that particular bet from an expected value perspective. So generally, if you're someone who does not enjoy volatility, I would say don't take that bet, because on a value perspective, you're losing something. However, if those odds change, right? If those odds change to flip a coin, bet $100, you win 500, you lose your 100. All of a sudden, it becomes a very interesting one, whether that's something you want to expose yourself to or not. Another thing which I'll throw in there is when it's a repeatable situation, or when it's a repeated situation. So let's say if you were to do that same coin flip 100 times, then I would definitely take that bet, because then the volatility shrinks over the number of events which are happening. And the exposure which I'm getting from one event is actually shrinking over time. Okay.
All right. So thank you so much, I think, and we will just keep an end of as far as the questions are concerned. Other questions, I'll just mail it over to Pramath. First of all, thank you so much, Pramath, for coming over and sharing your insights. I think they were phenomenal. The slides were great. Your thought process were way different, yet so connecting with the current situation. So thank you so much for coming over and presenting.
Thank
your
you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you, as part of the ongoing pandemic series, as one of the speakers, as part of the ongoing pandemic series. I would also like to thank our center director, Professor Anirban Ganguly, and all the faculty members who are part of CAPBREI for making the pandemic lecture series a reality and what it is today. Apart from that, I would also like to extend thank you to the amazing audience who were there and asked so many questions to Pramath. Thank you so much for being there always. And lastly, the video would also be, has been recorded. So we would upload it on YouTube as well, and I'll share the link on the website at JGBS and with you, Pramath, as well, so that in case you would want to share it with others afterwards, feel free to do that. Once again, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Pramath. Thank you, all the members and all the participants. Have a very good day ahead.
Thank you, guys.
Take care of yourself. Thank you so much.
Thank you.